All right. Hello and welcome to our, taped on leadership with Beth and Karima. For those of you who don't know, I'm Beth Napleton, and I am an expert on working with leaders in mission-driven organizations to help them reach their goals. And I love thinking about leadership and all its complexities. And so I do these interviews as a way to learn about the lessons of leadership from a variety of perspectives. And I'm so excited today to welcome you, Karima. I just think this is going to be so great for any leader who is leading for equity, but especially principals and network leaders and folks who are kind of working through layers of change. So for those of you who don't know, Karima Wilson is the founder and CEO of Foraged Ed, an organization whose mission is to help educators build schools where students of color thrive. Foraged Ed partners with educational organizations and schools and provides services from coaching to consulting to professional development. And before that, Karima worked for over a decade in schools in Houston. She was a bilingual teacher, an assistant principal, and a principal. And so I think you bring a really interesting perspective. And Karima, and we've known each other for a couple of years now, but in reading your bio, I did not realize we actually both have won the Harriet Ball Excellence in Teaching Award. You too. I was laughing. I was like, I think I was 2007. So I was like, you were 2009. And I feel like we were like ships in the, award night. So I think we must have overlapped in our time at KIPP, which I don't know that we ever have explored fully, but that's okay. Yeah. Great people end up meeting great people whenever it is the right time. And it's no surprise that there was a connection there.
Yeah.
So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to jump in and to have our conversation today. So
Totally. And for those of you joining us, I'm kind of doing a series right now on staff culture. And I felt like because of Karima's really important work with equity, I think it's really hard to have a thriving staff culture if you are not equitable or in the world of humans working towards equity, right? I don't know. Karima, you'll tell us if there's like a moment where people can like stamp their culture done. I have not found that moment. But if you're on that journey, if you're unpacking, if you're working towards it, I think those things all contribute. And so this is going to be really great. And Karima, we actually met, I believe, in the spring of 2020, shortly after George Floyd was murdered. And I had been leading my school at the time for about 8 years. And I just had the light bulb moment, which was probably several years too late, which was definitely several years too late, that I had really done everything I could as a CEO to move the needle on equity in my school. And it was time to bring in some outside expertise to come in. And so I forget, someone connected us or recommended it. You've also since gone on to work with my own children's school where I'm in the Equity and Justice Task Force. So I've seen from a variety of perspectives. And I'd love to know, and to help us understand, here we are in the spring of 2020. How long had it been since you started Foraged Ed, and what kind of led you to that moment in your career? I'd love you for you to walk us through your journey.
Yeah. So in some ways, my journey doing this work predates my journey as an educator. And so I actually was a person who, as a young person, did this. I guess at that time, the word that people were using was social justice, but it was a youth program. It was essentially a camp after my ninth grade year in high school in Birmingham, Alabama, which is where I grew up. And so it was sort of life-changing for me. The program's called Anytown, Alabama, and there were Anytowns all around the country. So I will randomly meet sometimes people who went to Anytown in New Jersey or in California. And it used to be sponsored by an organization called the National Conference for Christians and Jews, who renamed themselves National Conference for Community and Justice. And so they did interfaith work. And then this youth program was one branch of their community service work. And it would take people in Birmingham, it would take people from sort of diverse, different high schools around the city and bring them together. And Birmingham is typical of many cities in that the suburbs, are majority white, and then the city population and the city schools, or most suburbs are majority white, and you have a couple that are majority Black. And then the city center is very much a Black city. And so it's taking kids who don't go to school together, who don't live the same lives, and bringing them together. And so I did that as a youth and fell in love, and then sort of got involved in every way, shape, and form. And then through college and through that, I would go back and return there. I volunteered there. I even took a semester off of school and worked with them to develop sort of a volunteer training program. And through that work, I really became a facilitator of the work. And it came in some ways naturally to me because I grew up in a biracial household, one of what we would call the loving generation, or some people refer
Mm,
to. And so my parents, my mom was from California, my dad was from New York. My mom is white, my dad is black, and they settled in Birmingham, which has this, very unique history in the
yeah.
country. And it was sort of an interesting place for them to pick as home. But my dad had family there, and so we ended up there. But in many ways, then this work felt like, oh, these are the types of conversations people need to be having, and these are the types of
Mhm.
conversations in some ways we had at home at some point.
Yeah, yeah.
And then that came back when I was an educator. I said to myself, well, how do we make sure that we're not just saying all kids are the same and we're good teachers and we love our content and we love our knowledge, but we're also recognizing how much our social systems and just systemic oppression is still impacting our students'
Mhm.
lives outside of school and then often within schools as well. And so, how do we do that work? And when I was a principal, I sort of saw, I was like, oh, my school is going to be all of the things and we're going to be amazing. And every staff member, every community member is going to be super aware and they're going to be able to have hard conversations and they're going to reach all students. And that was very hard to make a reality.
Mm.
So the idea for the work that I do came over and over as a school leader when things that would happen that, and I would say, I don't have the bandwidth to address
Mhm.
this, but other people need to be out in the ecosystem to help school leaders sort of have the bandwidth, figure out what are the best ways of supporting educators in learning these lessons so that they're really helping all students.
Well, and it's interesting because it sounds like, I mean, I'm making some inferences here, but it sounds like you had the skills, but you didn't have the bandwidth. And I think sometimes leaders don't have the skills or the bandwidth,
Mhm.
or they have the bandwidth, but not the skills. And so I think that, we're both in the kind of small business helping school space. And I feel like that so often is what comes into play, especially because there's just so much that's in the principal's seat, right? So it's hard to do that. So that is so interesting. So, I would love to talk, Forge Ed is an organization that, your mission is to help build schools where students of color thrive. So before we get to kind of like what helps kids thrive, I would love to hear more about what you most often see getting in the way of this. What do you see as the problems? I know you work with schools all over the country. You work with private schools, public schools, charter schools, or charter schools are public schools. Sorry, that's one of my least favorite faux pas. But tell us a little bit about what you see and what the problems look like here.
Yeah, I mean, I think the problems look like all of the same. Schools are microcosms for society,
Mhm,
right? So
mhm,
everything
mhm,
that we see happening in society, we see coming into school, and whether it's coming in because the students are bringing, what they have at home, what they don't get at home, the needs they have. They're bringing in, the experiences that they have, even getting to school every day. And then we have the adults in the building, educators, whether they are from the community or oftentimes are not from the communities. And so they're bringing with them the set of biases and lack of knowledge or about the community that they're coming into. And then you have just so much of the school-based ecosystem still is the funding that goes behind it, et cetera, et
mhm,
cetera. So all of those things show up in schools to create places where we still just see these huge differences between who schools are serving truly well and who they're
mhm,
not serving as well, right? Who's going to school and through that education is having a transformative experience that
mhm,
either sets them on a path for the life they want to live or it just doesn't, and they're
mhm,
bored in school, they're not seeing the purpose of school, they're frustrated by school. So I think, we can name any of the systems of oppression that exist in society and say we see how they also show up in schools, whether they're
mhm.
shaping the school's policies or they're showing up in the building in the way students interact with each other, adults interact with each other. So you name it, you're going to see it in a school.
So there is no shortage of need for the work that you do, which of course, I think anyone who's spent, let's go with 10 minutes in schools is probably hopefully aware of. So, you bring your lens as a teacher and as an AP and as a principal to this work. So how does that inform your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I do now so much is really help either schools, educators within schools, future leaders, or people who are developing their lens as who do I want to be as a leader, to really think about how can I incorporate skills for building more equitable practices. How can we have the conversations that we need to be having to make sure that we're meeting our mission or our vision, and we're doing so for every student that we support. Or if we're working with a nonprofit, it's the same thing. Like, how are we working together to meet the needs of our clients or of our programs, and to support that work. So I think the way that my previous experiences comes in, it's just in being honest and thinking about what did I need for myself when I was in this seat, where were my concerns. And the reality is, it's also that I think the best educators, the best teachers, and then strong supportive administrators are really good at listening. And that's the same skill set you need when you're facilitating and when you're working with clients and asking them, what are you in need of, right? Because at this point, I haven't taught during a pandemic. I haven't led during a pandemic, right? So stepping into a school building right now, there has to be a share of humility on my end that
Mm-hmm.
the things that I knew to be true about schools may have shifted.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really the taking the skill of listening and taking the skill of empathy to bringing that to the work that we do with whomever our partner is.
Well, and I think like when we were working together, what I really appreciated, I think like your listening was exceptional. And I just feel like you got it. So like, I feel like there would be days I'd be like, we just had a situation at lunch. Can we move our meeting back 30 minutes? Or, you know, let's problem solve around our teachers not doing the pre-work for PD because, I want them to do it. And this is where we hope, but how do we kind of plan for the, what is it? Hope for the best, plan for the worst, and like, don't be surprised by anything in between. So I felt like that was really, helpful to have a thought partner who would like sat in the seat and who understood like just the humanity and what all the different factors that go in. It's different than like an office or a corporate environment. It's very human. There's lots of feelings. There's lots of moments. So when you're getting folks maybe at the end of the day for PD or, like whatever it is, like you have to really recognize that. And I just felt like that really, to me, made you stand out compared to some other folks that we had experiences with in different realms. So
thank you. Thank you.
Well, I think we both agree that it's lovely to have the consultants come in who know what you're going through, right?
Right.
We feel that. So yeah. So it's interesting. Like I think it was Maya Angelou who said, "When we know better, we do better," right? And we just shift as we grow. And so it's so interesting. I think about this all the time now. If I were founding a school, what would I do differently in 2022 that I did not do in 2012? So, I don't know if you ever think about this, but if you were leading a school today, and as you acknowledged, it's different, right? Certainly never led and couldn't have anticipated leading through a pandemic. But what would you do differently as you reflect?
Yeah, there are times where I really, sort of dream about what this would be, because there are still days where I'm like, maybe I want to go back and teach again, or go back and be a co-leader again, and in another lifetime, we'll see, right?
Yeah.
I think there's so many things I think that I would do differently. I mean, one part around what makes a school work, and I think in some ways we did this well, but thinking about it even more strategically would be this topic of staff culture or adult culture on campus, right? And I think that there are things that we did really well that we'll sort of get into around helping the adults on campus to be able to engage effectively with each other anytime that we had conflict, working to build a strong culture where we were all really clear on what the mission meant, what the vision for the school was, and also had a really strong shared base of understanding of what we meant when we said different things. But I think I would stamp down even more on just how you can support the social and emotional health of the people who work on school campuses, right? Because the work is it's grueling. It's also so individual, right? Teachers go to school they spend 80% of their day, either by themselves or in front of students, and with a wide age range, right? And then they come out and spend some other time with other adults in the building, and we're trying to all be going the same direction and working the same way, but we're doing so really sort of in these individual pathways. So I think it's super important to be able to build spaces for adults in the building to have social emotional supports, to have the space to have open conversations about the stress of the work, to get their needs met.
Mhm.
Some of that has to do with public school funding, which I will always be, saying over and over. We need to fund our schools way better than we do now,
Mhm.
in particular urban schools within urban cities, right? They're just underfunded, and that puts the weight of each day and each student on the individual teacher in a way that's really hard, right? And
Mhm.
in a way that a lot of teachers, people who have taught, find unsustainable, right? And so
Mhm.
that's a whole nother conversation. But one would be really attending to the adults in the building and their needs. I think then I would think about, what does our curriculum look like so that it's truly rooted in what students are care about and want to learn. It amazes me that we had a whole pandemic, which, you know, it's this crazy thing that we all experience from our own lens. And yet I didn't see many schools who were bringing it into school and who were
Mm.
saying, like, is this what, how do we learn about this? What does this look like in our communities? How is what you're seeing happen in your community different than what you're seeing the news talk about? What do you know about this? What questions do you have? And some schools I even know of or heard of that sort of shut down. We're not going to talk about the pandemic during the pandemic, and we're not going to teach about it. But they lived through history, and yet
Right.
it wasn't the topic of schools, right?
Total lost opportunity. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, that's not a critique of schools, because there's a lot of, how I did school was, we got the curriculum, we followed the curriculum, but when and how can we create curriculum that is truly responsive to what kids are actually going through? I have read a lot since leaving as a principal of Dr. Gloria Ladson Billings' work, and she talks about, one of her three tenets when we're talking about cultural relevant pedagogy is, how are you doing work that truly matters to students, right?
Mm.
It's the critical consciousness or the socio-political consciousness, but how are you enabling kids to develop, to use what they're learning to affect change in ways that impacts their life right now, not like,
Mhm.
not
Mhm.
saying
Not
once
like
you
okay,
go to
this is gonna
college
be
you can come back and help this community, but right now what can they be doing? And I think our schools just aren't even built for that, and our curricula, most of the stuff that's available for schools definitely isn't. So just wondering what that could look like and what it would take to create that is another thing I think a lot about.
That's so interesting. Well, and it seems like, and this even seems to have evolved in the, I mean, I guess it's been 20 something years now, but like also people seem to have a lot of opinions about what's taught in schools and like a really um incendiary flameful, like I
Right.
just I can't even like engage with some of the news on it because I'm like, I don't understand why you're at a school board meeting talking like this is not how it works. Like I don't show up in my dentist's office and say like, here's what kinds of anesthesia you should use. Like we leave these decisions to the professionals, but that is a whole separate conversation.
Mhm.
So, but I think makes that even more complicated. Yet you're right. Like when learning matters, like learning is so natural to kids when they're interested in something, right? Like anyone who's ever watched a toddler or a second grader with like Legos or books or building something or origami. So it's like really as educators, how do we tap into that vein and ride that? And like the kind of standard piece I think actually like can be applied in so many of those setups.
Yeah.
So
100%.
sometimes
I was going to say too about the whole, I mean, just naming that we're in the midst of a moral panic, right? Or a wave of what I've
Mhm.
heard a term to mean moral panic around teaching, basically teaching the truth in schools, which,
Yes, yes, yes.
some people have effectively labeled as not teaching CRT. But the reality is that too, well, yes, Oh, but just that phrase and understanding that what's happening right
Right.
now.
First of all, that's being insanely misapplied and misused and misunderstood and taken as a label and shorthand for, I don't know, teaching that it says in the Constitution that Black people are 3/5 of a person. Like, I don't understand. Like, don't get me started on how like this can be used to justify Supreme Court decisions, but we don't want to teach our children original. Like, I don't. It's anyway. Sorry, this is.
That'll be a longer tangent.
Yes.
Another day.
But I think that it is and it's been interesting. I know talking with you, you've mentioned that like there's a clear like sense of like schools are either like, we're in on this, like let's wrestle with this and let's figure this out and we're on this journey, or like we're not touching it. And I mean, there are very few things I think that are kind of like one way or the other. And it's fascinating because like no one says that about math, right? Although I'm like, but science, history, and ELA, all of those have their issues. So this country is a special place. So sometimes we learn leadership lessons, I think like quietly and over time. And sometimes we have moments that are like a light bulb moment that just kind of like smack us in the face. And I would love to hear about a time that you learned a leadership lesson and one of those kind of like profound light bulb moments.
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know if I would say a profound light bulb moment. Well, I'll say a lot of my journey, my first year as a school leader was realizing I sort of watched my successor, or the person I succeeded, the founder of the school, be, very strong and very charismatic and very able to get the whole school to be all on the same page. And I saw the things he did well, and I would be like, oh, that's great. And then I was very easily able to say, this is all of the things that, I would do differently, or sort of judgmentally say, oh, I'm going to, do this well. I just assumed everything he did well, I would have. And then
interesting. Yeah.
assumed that I would also have all these other strengths. And then when I became a school leader, I think I got feedback from either a teacher who I had previously taught with, or someone coming in, and they said, you always look upset. And I was like, I mean, there's a conversation to be had there about women leaders and what that means, and how we're expected to sort of appear. But I was really enjoying the year. It was a hard year. It was a year where there were the budget cuts that came from the financial crash of 2008-9 finally hit the schools. So, we were dealing with real deep budget cuts. And so people didn't always understand what that meant. But I think what I came to realize very soon is I couldn't try to be a leader in someone else's vein, right? Like I couldn't fit who I would be as a leader into what I thought I saw in this in my predecessor, right? And I had to learn what were my strengths, and then also be willing to accept what weren't my strengths, right? I'm an introvert, one. That's neither a strength nor a weakness, but in a school setting, sometimes it can be like, oh, I really would just like to go into my office and take a breath for myself right now, because I just made 50 decisions and we're at 8:30 and I need some time to breathe. And but this teacher is on their break right now and they want that sense of connection, and that's part of the constant day. Or the student just got sent to the office for this reason and it's time to have a conversation, figure it out, deal with it. So you don't control your own time as a principal. I mean, in some ways you can, but often everything comes to you. And so just I guess the leadership lesson was letting go of what I thought I would be as a leader and starting to get real about who I was as a leader, for better or for worse, and how I could then be effective given who I was as a leader.
It's so interesting because I don't think we've ever talked about this, but one of the things that I did as a school leader and now do is strengths coaching with like Clifton Strengths. And it's like, there are a million of these assessments, but it's like, how do you know yourself and then lean into that, because you will always be more effective leaning into who you are authentically. And there are lots of ways to be an effective leader, right? Some people are really strategic. Some people are excellent executors. Some people are really good at influencing. So there's lots of ways to do this. And I think that is just an important part of any journey, and in every new setting, every new role, every new year, right? Sometimes we need to relearn that even a little bit.
Right. And I mean, in some ways we learn that lesson as teachers, right? Because some people think, oh, to be a great teacher, you have to be the person who's in front of the kids and all the time, and that wasn't my style as a teacher. I was much more of a facilitative teacher. I taught in a way where the classroom could be a buzz and a whir, but you might come in and be like,
exactly. Yeah.
And so, but both of those styles can work and can be effective, and we'll find kids who, love them, or find students who love them. And I think the same, it's just transferring that lesson to leadership as well.
Totally. And it's interesting because I think it really goes to like your archetypes, right? Of like what great teaching is, which is so individual, just so based on your own experience growing up. This like really mattered to me and made a difference. And then I think as a leader, you're like managing all of that, like people bring that with them into the PD, right? So how do you like look, go under and see what's under the iceberg there and kind of help to understand like, well, what are we doing at this moment in time and where? So yes, it's been interesting to do with school teams. We always did it with our school teams, the strength stuff, because also this like helps like reinforce, you're going to look different and that's okay. And we have different strengths and yours is this and yours is that. And it was interesting because sometimes we'd be like, well, we did that. We don't need to do this. Like we did that last year. And it's like, actually it is a valuable use of 3 hours every year, right? To like remind people of their strengths in this lesson. So it's not linear, right? It's iterative in a lot of ways. So I would love to hear, I think, as someone who's, I think we both care a lot about justice and equity and kind of making schools better for kids and where they're thriving. And I talked to a decent number of leaders who feel like, look, I've done ABC, I've done XYZ. Like, what do I do to kind of keep moving on this way, right? Like, I know this is a journey. So, it's like, I don't know what the right language is for this question. Like, I don't know if it's like people who are like most advanced or pushing the envelope or like have really gotten the basics down. But I think there are a group of people out there who want to know, like, if I feel like I've cleared out some of the stuff, like I think people are sharing their ideas. We have a diverse staff, people on surveys, stakeholders are feeling recognized and included and valued. Like, where do I go next to kind of keep us on this journey? So I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on where that is.
Yeah. I mean, I think most often what the where next is, it's going to sort of raise its own hand. I think there's so many pieces of data that the average school has, most of that data is mandated for us, right? We have to do state testing. We have to do certain things. And then some of it is data that our organizations have chosen to use, right? Like staff culture, student culture, family and parent and family surveys, et cetera. But usually if we start to look at that data, it's going to point to where can we still be continuing to think about who we could be serving better, who could be thriving more, where are there opportunities, missed opportunities here, right? And then where does our staff or does our team need to learn and develop additional skills, right? Knowledge, skills, capacity, mindsets around what it means to be a great teacher for all kids, right? In the last couple of years, students have more access to information around gender identity. So you're seeing teachers in younger grades starting to be asked questions by their students that they may not have ever had to think about or had to answer, right? And so that's an example of like, look, there's, again, everything that's outside of society is going to show up in schools. And then the question is, how are we prepared for it, right? There's so many ways our students bring diversity to the classroom, whether that's their racial and ethnic backgrounds, their heritages, their languages that they speak at home and in school, their gender identities, their learning, whether
Mm-hmm.
they have, yeah, and also whether they have exceptionalities or disabilities and what that can look like in the classroom, right? And the way our model still is all of these students are in one room together learning at the same pace and same time. And so that means that there's going to be kids who we're missing the boat for and figuring that out. So I think another thing I would add there, and there's a new book that I've started reading through by, I'm going to forget the both authors' names, but the book is called Street Data. And it is, one author is Shane Saphir, and I will look for the other author. And it starts to ask too, what other pieces of data do we need? Like, are we doing enough listening to students and families? Do we have ways to check in and say what matters to you about what we're doing? And so, like I said, just started reading it. But I think in addition to the data that we sort of have mandated to us by the state, by our organizations, are we making sure we're gathering information from the people in the building and listening to that with the same intensity that we care about, test scores or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that was just again, one more endorsement for, I think, working together as a school leader. It was really helpful to be able to say, like, here's where we're uniquely at, and here's our community context, and here's our data, and here this is, and like, what is the right, here's where I think we should go. How do we get there? Right? Like, let's, individualize the path. So this episode is about part of the staff culture series, and you immediately came to mind because I don't believe that it's possible to have a vibrant and thriving culture unless it is diverse and equitable and inclusive. So, if I don't know if I'm missing something, and then I sometimes hear, right, like JEDI, right, and add the justice, or DIEB and add belonging. So but all those components seem incredibly important. And so one, am I missing something here? Is that actually possible? And then two, why is that the case? To having a strong staff culture, which I should say, the reason we're focused on staff culture is there are some organizations that work with clients or nonprofits and others with schools, but because your strong team culture, I think, as we both talked about, really turns around and unlocks the student culture, the student results, the student achievement, the learning, the purpose of the school. So it's very hard to get to that unlocked level unless you have that strong team culture. So back to the question, are these really important? And if so, why?
Yeah. I mean, so first I found her name. Author number 2 is Jamila Dugan. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And I think your question is really important because, yes, I would 100% say that it's super important. I mean, I think part of they just go hand in hand, right?
Mm-hmm.
So many schools, organizations, some are very recent. I think there are people who made this realization or the clamor for it post the murder of George Floyd, sort of said, okay, well, what are we doing and what does this look like? And a big part of that was, who do we have in the building?
Mm-hmm.
And in what ways is that representative of our clients, of our students, of our families, right? And I think when you start to ask that question and you say, who is in the building, and do we have the right set of educators in the building to really meet the needs of the student? Then you also have to say, are they going to stay, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because we all know how hard it can be to retain teachers.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's even harder now, right? Again, why I can say, I know what it was like years ago. And then at this point, in the midst of the pandemic, there's just these additional challenges of, trying to make sure you're retaining teachers. So I think so much of that, and there's been so much written and so much research about all of often what is extra work that some teachers are being asked to do, right? It's often called the black tax, or one way it's talked about is the black tax, right? Where educators who are African American are doing the regular load of the teachers, but then they're also, often expected to be the disciplinarian, often expected to hold on to an extra group of kids that are not their own students because they're the ones who have the relationships and are able to support those students when they're in times of needs, or help them think through discipline decisions, et cetera, et cetera. They might also have an extra club that they're running, right?
Yeah.
A leadership club or whatever we want to call it, which really is about them providing a space for students who identify with them, right? And this is just one example. It can look different depending on the educator's background, right? Maybe this teacher is the only teacher who speaks Spanish in the building, and so they're always being called on to translate when a translator is needed. And so I think about, when you think about the work and the team that you have and how that team is meeting the needs of your students, I think the first part is thinking of the diversity, right? When we work to hire teachers at my old school, that would mean, one, regardless of a person's race or background, also, do you speak Spanish? Because the majority of our family speak Spanish, right? So I speak Spanish, it's not my first language. And we had, 3 or 4 staff members who didn't grow up speaking Spanish, but they spoke Spanish. And I think it was important to say that that is not enough, but then how are the collective experiences and skills going to meet the needs, right? Because if you have, one Spanish speaker in this case on the whole staff, or one per even grade level, we tried to
they're disproportionately
being asked. And so then the second part of that is, what is the culture that you're creating that allows for that says everyone that you're hiring that's great and amazing is going to stay, right? Because if it's not an inclusive culture, so if it's not a culture where everybody can be themselves, if it's not an equitable culture where you're acknowledging, hey, this person, there's not a lot of extra money in schools, but are you providing stipends, extra money? If you're asking someone to constantly be the translator, if you're asking someone to stay after school to support you, if you're asking someone to look through your professional development and think about, is it culturally relevant? Is it inclusive, right? So that's when we're thinking about equity, when we're making sure that the work, if it's different, it's compensated differently, or we're acknowledging that the ways in which we bring different skills. So I think the first is bringing the people there and the way you need to recruit to get them there. And then the second is, how are you building a community that is both inclusive, so everyone can be their full selves, and then also equitable, so that the work that people are doing is fair. You're aware of the ways and shapes in which it's different. And that can be, some roles also, like deans of culture and assistant principals who are dealing with discipline all day long. Like, that's an emotional toll. And how are you thinking about that, right? So just thinking about diversity is great as a starting point, but you're not going to keep a diverse staff unless you're also building an inclusive and equitable culture.
I have so much to say on this off the record about the particular situations that we've been in. But yes, I think that's exactly right. And then people, I think, often will sit and say, well, like, look at this. And it's like, also, let's the starting point is diversity. Like, let's look at where is the diversity among the leadership versus among the support staff versus teachers, and where are kids seeing. And there's just so much to go. And then what are your pathways? And one of the things I've loved doing with clients is working on then, like, what's the leadership pathways? Like, if you're a paraprofessional pool, you feel like could be great teachers, but like, oh, no one gets certified. Well, what can you do to put in place to help incentivize this, to help people see a path for themselves at your school, to help cultivate that leadership and career paths organically? If you have a vacancy at your school for a leader, how come you can't fill that from your teaching pool, right? What could you put in place? And I'm not saying we should move people straight from the classroom to leadership. That's its own set of challenges. But, are there instructional coach roles, department chairs, like, where they can stair step to some of the skills that are needed? So anyhow, so this topic came up pretty organically, right? So we were kind of catching up, and you mentioned that you had an upcoming session on conflict for a school. And it really just struck me because conflict is such a crucial part of a healthy staff culture. And I don't know that people often think that. I think sometimes in our society, we think like conflict is bad. Like, if there is conflict, there is a problem. But actually, conflict is a sign of health. So would love for you to tell us a little bit about why.
Yeah. So it's interesting because that session was actually about helping teachers navigate conflicts in the midst of having what we use the language from Daryl Wingsu called race talks, which is
Mm,
just, how are teachers and adults bringing up and supporting or responding to when kids are asking tough, challenging questions about, race or current events, right? So there are, tons of conversations, but one of the things that we realized there was this resistance is people were like, well, if I go to have this conversation, how is there conflict involved? Because in this series we talk about those conversations with students, we talk about those conversations with colleagues, with families and parents, and then if you're addressing someone, who's above an admin to a teacher, whatever the situation may be. And so the inability or the fear of conflict can often be a deterrent, right? So
mm,
we're talking about reframing and understanding that, to your point, conflict is healthy, and our ability to engage in conflict successfully builds a strong culture, right? And
mhm,
I don't think
mhm.
anyone likes having conflict in the moment, but then afterwards, many people say, "Oh, I feel better. I feel
Yes.
closer. I feel more connected. I'm more committed," right? And in some ways, I mean, some people love working out, but there's those of us who work out because we feel the endorphins, we feel healthier
Mhm,
afterwards, and we understand what it does for us. And so, whatever metaphors we want to find, but we need to no longer put conflict and the fear
mhm,
of conflict, allow that to determine how our campuses are going to look, because being conflict avoidant just has so many ramifications that inhibit a school from really moving forward. And there are so many conflicts in our work every day,
mhm, mhm,
whether
mhm.
it's interpersonal, hey, you're using a copy machine right now and I need it, as simple as that can be,
Yeah.
or, really bigger, like we have different shared values, and we have different ideas of how students best learn, and we're co-teachers and we need to navigate that. Or I'm pushing in to support students with disabilities, and you are teaching in a way that's not accessible to them, and I need to engage you around that
Mm,
topic. You know, we know there are like conflicts every day, right? So being able to have them successfully, but then also shifting where the culture is, this is part of what we do, this is part of how we interact with each
yes.
other, is a really, I think, important and critical shift to any organization being successful and healthy.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there are so many parts of conflict, like understanding the perspective of others, using I statements to express yourself, active listening, repeating, that just are good muscles, right? Like in life.
Yeah.
Um, and so like these will serve you well in all areas. And honestly, I think that, I think a lot of teachers, use these skills with their kids and their students, and it really builds wonderful classroom cultures. And so sometimes we also need to do some learning as adults. So
Yeah, it's one of the funny things is, over the years we've done different books, whether it's Crucial Conversations or
uh,
Difficult Conversations, and now we've developed our own model that more brings in systemic oppression, because if some
yes,
of
yeah,
the books
some,
don't
yeah,
talk as much about
yes,
the conflicts we have as we're working to change the world from how it
into
is to how
systems,
we
yeah.
want it to be. But I have people who taught with me who send me, I've gotten a couple of Facebook messages, text message, and say, "Hey, I know we did a lot of stuff, but just want to say thank you for having me read Crucial Conversations because it helps with my partnership over here."
Yes, yes,
So,
exactly, exactly,
yeah.
exactly. On a related note, I just started reading a book about couples therapy that I'm applying to my children and our relationship, because it turns out that like a lot of our skills about being relational with others are true in our professional environments and our personal environments, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So is there like, I think it's like some people might say, well, we never have conflict at our organization, which I would say is a huge red flag. And then there are people who might say, oh my gosh, like it's nonstop, which I would imagine also has its problems, right? Because to me, that might signal that things aren't being resolved, right? Or that there's perhaps some unhealthy interpersonal elements there. Like, is there like a Goldilocks version of just right? Or what are signs that, it's you're kind of in that sweet spot as a leader of enough healthy conflict?
Yeah, I don't know that I could put my finger on like an amount. I'm
Yeah.
trying to think what were the things that I sort of knew for myself as a leader.
Mhm.
Um, One thing that I started to sort of remind myself, if you don't address it now, you're going to address it later, right?
Yes, yes,
And
yes.
so if I were like having imaginary conversations in my head or imagining addressing an issue that I had yet to address, because again, the day's so busy and what I
Mhm.
what we can't do as school leaders is go take a person out of teaching to say, hey, can we address this conflict right
Yes,
now,
yeah.
right? So there's also sometimes a conflict or a situation could have happened that you want to address and unpack and think about, what did it mean for you? What did it mean for us? Are we still on the same page? And it could take a week to find the
Yes,
time to do
yeah.
between two people's schedules in a school, right? And if it's more complicated than that, say it's a whole team that has a conflict, then the same thing, right? So I think that can be one that's really hard. But I guess the sort of amount is, are you going home and thinking about the conflict
Yes.
that you haven't had, or are you still too afraid to have conflict with one person or one type of conflict, right? Do
Mm,
you're able to address everything related to um I don't know, curriculum. You're really on top of it,
yeah.
like we're
You can have robust, healthy exchange of
yeah,
ideas, yeah.
and then when it comes to issues of student culture or discipline, you're avoiding addressing
Mhm.
a breach of an agreement that you all had made, right? So I think there's a lot of ways to know, but I feel like people know because they're sitting with it. If
Yeah,
they're
yeah, that's a tell, right? Yeah.
And I think the other thing is, so much depends, like, it's, there were years where we had very little turnover, but we added new team
Mhm,
members.
mhm.
And then there are years where we had a lot of turnover. And so with that, and with every school year being so different, sometimes you have turnover within the school year. You have to go back and say, this is who we are, this is how we do
Yeah.
things, and get people who are new to the culture on board, and sometimes really quickly, right? In the middle of the year, if a teacher
Mhm,
comes in,
mhm.
they're learning so many things, but how do they also learn, this is how we do things here?
Yeah,
And
this
part
is
of
how our
how we
team
do
works.
things here is engage with each other directly when we have disagreements. So I think giving each giving yourself grace if you're in a school building, to just recognize, like, okay, does it feel like we're having a ton now? Is that because we just had, three new teachers show up, or we switched people moved grade levels and positions, and so yeah, we're going back through that storming, norming, forming, you know
Mm,
phases. And that can happen yearly in
yeah,
school, right?
absolutely. Absolutely. I think sometimes you think, oh, like, but we've done that. It's like, no, that was actually the team 2 years ago. And so this is a different team, or this is in a different environment. And it's interesting because even as you're talking, I'm thinking a lot about, I think we did a lot of work over the years on restorative justice practices for students. And I think there's so much that's analogous, right, with staff, like the idea
Yeah.
of like rupture and repair and how do you, right? So it's interesting to think about those elements too. And again, like, because if you want to see it in your student culture, it needs to live in your staff culture.
Mhm, mhm, mhm.
Is there anything else before we go the lightning round that you would tell people thinking about healthy staff culture and DEI work and conflict? Any and all of the above, or just your general wisdom?
I'm not sure what else. Let's see what else. I mean, I think I would tell people, if you're a leader, get a coach. Because we always need the people who
Yes.
can help us learn. So I think so much of leadership is about self-awareness and learning for yourself. And so, part of that is knowing and understanding your blind spots and getting support. But I think oftentimes to do that, you need coaches who are able to support you in that way.
Mhm.
And then when it comes to helping build schools that are equitable, where all of our students can thrive, again, sort of the same. If you need support, or if you're not clear on the vision, or if you're not clear where the next step of work is, um, reach out. There are other schools who are doing great work, or reach out and find people who can support you on that journey. Because I think we're moving from the place where the expertise sits here and here and here, and
Mhm.
really start to see that every person in the school needs to have the set of skills if
Yeah.
schools want to become schools for everyone, schools where all students are successful. Then every teacher, every person in the building needs to have shared mindsets and shared vision and share and lots of skills. And so getting the support you need to move there.
Absolutely. That's awesome. Well, let's move to the lightning round, which I always love because I get great recommendations on what to read and listen to. So I'd love to start. What is a book or two or three, if you want, that has meant a lot to you professionally that you would recommend to people?
Yeah. I said I wouldn't prepare for this round, and now I have to think about it. So for the work that I do, there's a group of scholars from UMass Amherst, and they've written two books, Teaching for Diversity and Social Justice and Readings for Diversity and Social
Mm,
Justice. And I think for people who, want to do facilitation in this area, it's a great way, or who want to design sessions, even if people are designing sessions within their own organization, it's a great resource. So I'll share those two. Yeah, I'll share those two.
that's great. That sounds awesome. Now, I don't know. What did you teach, Karima, when you were a teacher?
I was ELA. Well, for 1 year, I taught everything. 2 years, I was self-contained, and in that school, we didn't teach science because that was my break. Was their ancillary.
Yeah, yeah, specials. Yeah.
Yeah. But I've taught fourth grade math, fourth grade social studies, but then most of my time was as a ELA, so either reading and writing. So
So same with me. So I always go to the books. The books are helpful. The books are, but
yes.
people do learn in other ways: podcasts, newsletters, websites, tools. So is there another resource that's been really impactful for you?
Yeah, I love podcasts. Right now, I listen to a lot of entrepreneurship podcasts,
Mm,
um, since that's where my learning is. But I think there are great podcasts, and there are podcasts who are sort of out there. The other thing is, if there's a community I'm looking to learn more about, then I'll go find a podcast. If I know someone who's a member of that community, I might recommend, like, what's a podcast you listen to, and then I'll go to start to learn and listen to podcasts to learn more about it. It's not like, I don't then think I'm an expert, but I think it starts to help me understand and to see what does it mean to be a member of this community that I'm not a member of. So I'm trying to think if I have any. I mean, the easy one to start, if you're interested in learning more about topics of race, you could start with Code Switch. Um, and then there are great story podcasts about the history of education, educational segregation. There's This American Life episode with Nicole Hannah Jones back when her work was more strictly focused on that. It's an expanded version of that, that I think there's some one-off episodes that are great too that I can recommend.
awesome. Yes. And now it's coming back to me. I feel like we did a lot of podcasts as part of our learning and some of our context building, and it was wonderful. So you always have good podcast recommendations.
Yeah.
How about some mentors who you know personally who've meant a lot to you?
Yeah, I guess I would say in some ways some coaches that I have had, my own coaches. I'm trying to think. I think our first mentors are family members.
Mm,
So I had an aunt who we only had my mom and dad in Birmingham with us, but then a sister of my dad moved down, aunt, and her a child who's the oldest cousin. So I would say she was probably my first mentor. And she passed away from cancer. So there are times now where I'm like, I want that.
yeah,
There-
yeah. I wish her advice. I miss that. Absolutely.
just a conversation. What would you tell me now? What would you think now? And then, professionally, I've had coaches that I would name and say, like, this really helped me to just push to where I am and to be more aware, and then to be more comfortable being myself as a leader, right? Because I think
Mm,
when you don't look like the model of leadership, which we often is very male, very white,
mhm.
um, and you operate differently, to learn to say this is okay and this is effective and you're actually doing a great job is important. And so I think some of the mentors I have helped me with that.
Awesome. How about, I sometimes think about mentors from afar. So we might not like be able to text them or call them or reach out to them, but we learn a lot from them as leaders generally. So any mentors from afar?
Yeah, I think some books that I've been reading and thinking about, one for facilitation would be Emergent Strategy.
Mm,
Yeah. I've heard her name pronounced differently. I always thought it was Adrienne Marie Brown, but I've heard it as Mari. So I need to go hear
okay.
what's her name. I'm trying to think of others that I would name. I think I would just say, like, there's any number of scholars that you can read, who you sort of
Mhm.
have as like your personal, I'm reading this person's work and reading what they said and seeing how they went about navigating the world. So,
That's awesome. And then what is something that you are just loving in your life right now?
mm, I think I'm loving my home. Uh, it's new. Well, it's newly my home. I was able to go from renting it to buying it during the pandemic, which was exciting. But I also had my dad here, who I was caretaking for, and then now he's not here anymore. And I'm like, oh, okay. Now I have the time and the space to. He hasn't passed away. I don't want anyone to think that.
Yeah. But he's getting some more. Yeah.
Yeah, I tapped out and my siblings tapped in, so we just sort of were able to
Yeah.
share in that. But then it means like the time that I was sort of using that
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
caretaking time now is like, okay, what do I want my house to look like, and how do I make a home and spend my time? So I
And I
think
can paint and I can put holes in walls and yeah.
so it's fun.
Oh, that's awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming, Karima. I always learn so much in our conversations. And while we have not ever interacted in this format before, this confirms that there is, to my knowledge, not a time and a way in which I do not learn from you. So I would love, folks are listening and want to learn a little bit more, or just tell folks how they can learn more, because other than listening to this on repeat.
Yeah, so they can follow us on Instagram. We have Instagram, forged_ed. And then you can go to our website if you're interested in working with us, forgeded.com. And then also, I'll plug that we're going to be having a series specifically on conversations for equity. It'll be virtual this summer, July 22nd. And so hopefully when you post, I can send you the link and the information.
Yeah.
About that series, because I think that's a set of skills regardless of where you are. It's not just how are we having and engaging in these conversations that might have conflict and we care deeply about, but how are we doing it about sort of what some people call hard topics, but how are we doing it when we're working to change what's not working about society for so many of us, right? How are we addressing biases or prejudices? How are we analyzing policy and culture, in our organizations, and how do we have those conversations effectively? So that's what that session will be about.
And is it on your website also, and I'll put information in there as well?
Yeah.
Got it. Cool. Great. Awesome. Well, if you liked hearing this information, these gems, you enjoyed it or were inspired, what I would encourage you to do is to join my newsletter list. So it's bethnapleton.com, which is up on the screen, or just my name as in your podcast title.com. And a little pop-up will come and that has some resources, inspiration. And there are actually changes coming to it, which I thought would be made by now, but aren't, but they will be coming. They're in the works. So you'll love it as leadership resources. So Karima, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for sharing and for helping us all become a little bit better in our leadership. So it's much appreciated.
Thank you.